Welcome, dear students. Our current session focuses on why and how to study the history of a language, and I would give some examples. I hope and expect by the end of this session, you would be able to understand why and how linguists have made attempts to trace and document the history of languages and of the English language particularly, and why and how it is important to study the history of a language. Well, my dear students, I'm sure you know language in general is an ability that we inherit. We, by birth have the ability to, learn languages. However, we learn specific languages in specific cultures, in the contexts where we live. So, for example, if we are exposed as a child, if one is exposed to a culture where English language is spoken, that person would learn English. So, actually, we can know the underlying ability only through studying the actual languages. If we want to understand how far human beings have the ability to learn languages, actually that again has to be done through a certain or some languages. Thus, one of the best reasons for studying languages is to find about how, about our existence. How have we survived through the times? It is about what makes us the people we are. There are various approaches towards the study of language, and when we talk of the historical approach, this is one of the most significant approaches towards the study of language, where we trace in the history how a certain language takes birth and passes through different stages of life. To understand often how things are, it is most of the times, helpful to know how they got to be there. If anything, any entity that you want to understand, if you know its past, how it was created, how it came into being, it becomes easier to understand that entity. Same is the case with language. To understand any language, the existing status of any language, historical approach helps us understand tracing the origin of that language, how it has developed, where it has come from, who were the ancestors, what were the stages in its development. So, these are all valid reasons for why a language should be studied. I would just draw an analogy, I will give a comparison, that if a psychologist wants to understand a person's behavior, for that the psychologist needs to know, where does this person come from, where does he belong to, what kind of past that person had, etc. So same goes for, languages. And this is very true for languages, that historical approach really is helpful in understanding, any language. Another reason for why languages should be studied and why, for instance, the English language should be studied. There are many irregularities in, for example, the English language today, that we can understand why these irregularities are there if we study the history. So, history or the study of the past of the English language would help us understand the reasons or the logic behind those irregularities. I would just give you the example of certain plurals. If you look at the screen, some examples of man to men, instead of mans, or from mouse to mice instead of mouses, or from goose to geese, or from ox to oxen, for example. If we want to understand why these irregularities in making the plurals, we need to go back to the history of the English language to understand that. One more reason, for the study of language and for the study of English language in our case. Spelling of modern English, which may seem chaotic today, where a lot of, times rules are not followed, where there are a lot of exceptions, and where we struggle to understand why it is so. The history of English language helps us understand a lot of times why it is so. So, I am going to give you An example, this is an oft-quoted joke by Bernard Shaw. He was one of the great writers of English. He once said that fish can be spelled in English as goatee. What did he mean? He gave the example, look at the word enough. In enough, fur sound is produced by this. So, for fish, if we replace this first fur with this, because this also produces fur sound in enough, in the same way, this O as in women. So, because this is not produced as, O, this is produced as women, E sound. So he says if it is replaced with this I of the fish, and we take this as, here, and this T as in, nation. Here, shun sound is produced, but interestingly, TI is used. So if we take that instead of this sh sound, from this sh sound, this becomes goatee. So, he was talking about the obscure nature of the spellings in English language. How, there is a disparity between the spelling and the pronunciation. Now, the only way to understand all this, why it is so and how it is so, is if we trace the history of language. Present-day pronunciation and the meanings of words, if we look at certain words, for example, if we look at the word cupboard, it does not suggest a board for cups. It is something, to understand that we need to go back into the history of the word, how it was originated. Think of the syntax. Think of this example, for example. She wanted to secretly finish writing her novel. Look at the placement of this word secretly. By changing its placement, she secretly wanted to finish writing her novel. She wanted to secretly finish writing her novel. She wanted to finish secretly writing her novel. These are many options. How do they affect the meaning? Again, and how we reach a certain choice in today's world. We need to study the history of English language to understand that once again. Look at the words. Heal, whole, healthy, hail, holy, etc. Do we find any connection? All right, we cannot understand until and unless we go back to the history of English language. So, there are many reasons for which, we can study the history of English language, many reasons that justify the explorations in the history of English language. In fact, the knowledge of the history of English language is no nostrum or panacea for curing all the linguistic ills. And by the way, why these words are used as names for certain medicines, for example, panacea, that is, a medicine for all the ills. But, to understand how these were created, how these were coined, what is, in the background, again, you need to take a historical approach to look into the history, how they developed. Another reason for the study of English language, particularly, or any language, can be the literature of that language. By reading the literature of particular language, we can understand a lot of things about that language. I will show you an example here on the slide. Well, my dear students, on the slide, you can see a couple of lines that are taken from a poem of Keats. The lines are given here in red color. I'm reading the lines. The sculptured dead on each side seemed to freeze, imprisoned in black, purgatorial rails. Now, my dear students, if after reading those lines, you try to create an image of, what Keats is describing, probably for a modern reader, from the word imprisoned, the idea of, because the word imprisoned is used and then the word rails is used, this word is used. So, the idea of the prison bars or the prison rails would come to the mind. And probably somebody would think of a fence around, these statues. But rails here, the word is taken from Old English, where the word was, it had a different meaning, and the meaning was garments. So it refers to the shrouds or the funeral garments in which the stone figures were clothed. So, how much of the misinterpretation of the meaning happens here if the modern reader reads it and does not have the knowledge of the history of English language and the history of these words, how they were used. Another example on the screen you can see is from the general prologue. That is, from the Canterbury Tales that was written by Chaucer, one of the, Middle English poets, a well-known poet. A line is taken here in the red color, you can see that. His horse were good. Now, I would just like you to look at the agreement between the noun that is used and, the verb form that is used. We are not clear whether the knight had one horse or more than one horse, because the verb that is used is were, that is a plural form, whereas the noun that is used is horse. It is not horses. So it's a singular form. Well, actually, if we trace the history back, we would realize that the knight indeed had several horses. This horse actually means horses. And how do we know that? If we trace the history of English language, we know in Chaucer's days, horse was a word that was used for both the singular and the plural, like the word deer or sheep, as we use these today, both for singular and for plural. So I hope overall all these examples help you understand why and how the study of the history of a language is significant and why we should study the history of English language if we want to understand the current status and position of English language in the world.